I am a academic and a scholar, so I write text, right? And I read it to you, but do not fear, it's not a very academic text, so it's not like, with a lot of difficult words. The title is Public Space as the Realm of the Possible. I could have just as well called it Public Space as the Realm of the Impossible, but as a writer, I've learned that if you start with a negative, people tend to stop reading, and I agree with that. Why read on if someone says it's impossible? All right. So the Dutch Foundation for Art and Public Space, SCORE, that Hakan was referring to, and that is dependent to the Public Art Agency, and there's a lesson to be learned here probably, existed from about 1999 to 2012, and it was internationally well known for its experimental programming and the realization of outstanding works in public space that have set an example for many countries in Europe. It's a bit grimy slides, but they're from the internet. Between 1999 and 2009, SCORE worked on a large-scale project, and the budget was 8.5 million euro, and that's, I think, 85 million Swedish crowns. They worked on a large-scale project in an area called Leidse Rijn, near the city of Utrecht. It lasted for 10 years, and it comprised of a lot of different, I'm not going to show you all, but it comprised of about 15 different events. With it, SCORE was able to work along the lines of an idea that has been playing a major role in the discussions about art for the public domain in the Netherlands, but no doubt also in your countries. This idea is that art should be incorporated into development plans from the very beginning, and not at the very end, when the planners discover that in between their nicely designed buildings there is an empty space called public, and that the space is so lacking in meaning that it has to be filled with a work of art. A work of art that, of course, then cannot repair the damage already done. Leidse Rijn is a large new neighborhood near the city of Utrecht, and SCORE was involved in it from the very, very start. Not, of course, in the whole planning of the area. Developers are far from allowing that, but involved in the programming and producing art and events as part of the developing process. So the new inhabitants of the new houses were confronted with a whole series of projects, events and exhibitions that, looking back after more than 10 years now, clearly show the ideals most of us then fostered about the role and function in and for the public. What you see here is the event called Parasite Paradise, in which experimental forms of living and dwelling by a wide array of artists and architects were assembled on an empty lot to function as a temporary fairground. So there were things by Vito Acconci, Big van der Pol, and a lot of different names. A comment, of course, on the more standard housing projects the newcomers were moving into. A way to make them think, become conscious of alternatives, and of course to see the temporary forms of art and architecture and have fun. It was also had to be really a sort of funfair event. I'll just show a couple of examples. It was also a time in which we reflected on the value of existing works of art in the public space. Did they still function for the sites they were placed in? Were they being valued by the citizens around them, or were they lost, orphaned works looking to be pensioned? Carousel, by the German artist Manfred Pernice, approached this question by temporarily replacing existing works from the city of Utrecht to a large roundabout at the entrance of Leidse Rijn. The works were replaced by others from time to time and could be rearranged, so you can see they can be moved around. But more importantly, they made visible if citizens of Utrecht cared about these works or not. In some cases, no one seemed to notice that the sculpture had disappeared. In other cases, the whole neighborhood would rise up in protest. And although this is a very interesting case for us working with art in public space, because it shows you the value people attach to certain works, us analyzing it because we always struggle with this question, how to measure this. You know, how do you measure the importance works of art have for the people living around them? I wonder how much it meant for the people of Leidse Rijn. Were they aware of all these aspects? And one of the main themes of the whole Beyond enterprise was, as it is still today, the notion of community forming. The idea that art in public space brings people together, gives them a chance to meet and to get to know each other, therefore, thereby overcoming all their differences. These sheep are not ironic here, so that's not the people, that's not the people I'm talking about. This paper dome from the Japanese architect Shigeru Ban explicitly had this function. And for a while it functioned, or was supposed to function, as the heart of the new neighborhood, to be replaced after some time, and now it's gone of course, by the new shopping center that will be the real heart of the neighborhood. I will not go into the question if art is the right means to bring people together, if it can form a community at all. We can maybe discuss that later, or tomorrow morning perhaps. In line with the community forming, the idea of community empowerment came up. So that's in the line. So you bring people together, but the next step is also, of course, you give them control of what's happening. According to this idea, and I'm sure you're all aware, art should not represent the powers in control or just embellish a site, but hand over the control to the people that live there, give them ownership of their own surroundings. This is an empty plot of land taken out of the commercial circulation system and handed over to the people to use as they would wish. It's by the, I think, Danish architectural organization N55. At first, these architects wanted to place some containers there to be used by anyone, so open spaces to be appropriated by anyone. But of course, that project was esteemed to be too much in danger of being damaged, to be too much out of control in a certain sense. So in the end, it was just an empty plot of land with the word land on it, as you see here. And it has been there for quite a long time. I'm not sure if it's still there. As far as I know, the only users, apart from a party now and then, have been the sheep you saw in the last slide. Satisfied users, no doubt, but not the ones intended. What remains of Beyond, what was left there for the people to enjoy or use, was in the end a sculpture park. This is a work by Lucas, the Dutch sculptor Lucas Lenglet. And this is a work by Fernando Sanchez Castillo. In my eyes, it is a bit disappointing that it all ends in one of the more traditional forms of art in public space. And it is very symbolic or even ironic that a former street barricade from Paris '68 has been transformed by Sanchez Castillo into an empty sign in a park. It is as if the ideals about the role of art in public space were given up at the very moment they were explored and tested. So there's really two sides to this whole project. Not long after this, so in 2012, SCORE was terminated as an organization completely. So no budget cuts, just gone from one day to the other, and they never saw it coming. So that's also a lesson. They didn't saw coming that they would be finalized. And it was part of general cuts by a right-wing government. And the whole art world in Holland suffered and is still suffering from that. We're still not recovered. In the years after, so since 2012, the conditions for art in public space in the Netherlands have deteriorated. In many cities, the budget for art in public space was cut and people working as advisor or organizer were fired. Commissions, if there were any, were set up along the lines of public-private cooperation, which implied that they had to be calculated as part of the building process from the start and were skipped as soon as there were budget problems. A system based on mutual distrust which is not very good for developing interesting forms of art for public space. And it's the public-private partnership is a favorite construction at the moment, but it always leads to problems, and one of the first victims of these problems is always the art that is supposed to be realized. At this moment, the situation is better, but only insofar that building is booming again, that there's money for projects and placemaking, and that artists are in demand again. But most of the know-how about art in public space has disappeared. There's hardly any debate about it, and no one seems to be sure where to go and what to do. And an extra problem in this is that a lot of the social services have been decentralized. So they're no longer effectuated by the central government, but every city has on its own to take care of housing the poor, taking care of healthcare, people with mental problems, etc. Now, and of course, if there's a budget discussion, then art has to cope, is in competition with money for healthcare, and of course, that's not an easy competition to win, right? So, in the cities, it's still a very precarious situation. But I still think this is a good moment to start reflecting about art in public space from scratch. Because beyond, the project by SCORE also made very clear that some of the ideas about what art in public space can do were over-optimistic. And that reaching communities, letting alone bringing them together or giving them ownership, is much more complicated than we thought at the time. I go back in time. It might be a bit boring, but be with me. According to Habermas, who you all know, this was the place in the 18th century where democracy started in the form of a debate culture that was overcoming the boundaries of wealth and class, at least some of those boundaries. This is the famous coffee house. I think this is in Budapest. The ideal of an open society in which important issues could be discussed, a shared space of common interest, although packed with opposing views. A change of forms of contact, behavior and place that of course also infected the ideals around the private life, or were in turn influenced by changes in the ideas about private in relation to the public. Changes explored and analyzed by Richard Sennett in his classical study, The Fall of Public Man. This combination of private and public is what I would like to call the public-private constellation, an ideal idea of perhaps vague notion of new forms of living and behaving that led to new unknown mingling of classes of society, and an unknown mixing up of public behavior and private feelings, as of course also propagated in romantic theory of the time. So the consequence of this is it's not the new places that make the new public space available, it is rather the new ideal that is translated into new spaces supposed to make this ideal real. But in this translation process, the new publicness is also channeled in a way that gives it a clear form, but also diffuses its potential. If we look at the beginning of the 19th century, the new places for public bourgeois culture are not only the emerging democratic institutions, but also, and even more prominently, of course, the theater, the concert hall, and the museum. Public appearance there, in all these places, is combined with private feelings. They play on your private feelings. You're there to feel, to experience something. Places where the new ideal could be shared, culture could be available to all, with money, of course, no longer with a certain birthright. So places that include and exclude at the same time. In a sense, the public space has been reduced to institutional democracy and high culture, while the voicing of difference, the debate, you could say, the multiplicity of perspectives has been outsourced to artists performing in these places. You could also say that at the very moment that art became the free expression of human feelings to be felt and shared by all, it also became instrumental in certain processes of exclusion and closing off of the public domain. Places of debate turned into places of silence. Of course, you're not supposed to have a debate in a theater or in a concert hall, or certainly not in a museum. A new ideal of public space started to exist from the end of the 50s and to the end of the 60s. The street as free space, a space for all to be present, to contest, to meet, to occupy. A theater of the crowds, the visibility of youth culture, a new use of the city as a scene of real life, a platform of public protest. And I'm sure you all know the images of the time. This is, of course, from The Situationist. This is May 68. This is the Provost in the center of Amsterdam, literature. And this was at a certain moment for the Provo movement, they were not allowed to use banners with political slogans on it. So, for instance, Johnson murderer. So they walked around with a white banner and were arrested for wearing a white banner around, which of course confirmed their point that it was a very authoritative situation. And again, this was a new private-public constellation. It was also based on a new ideal of personal life. No longer part of the system, you are no longer part of the system, but you create your own way of life as an individual. Free sex, communities, communes, etc. Theater, concert hall, and museum were replaced by the street. Or they tried to get closer to the street, opening up their programs and doors. Institutions changed from inside out, and for a short while, an equal society seemed to be just around the corner. So there's this famous exhibition that says a lot in the Van Abbe Museum, that we heard a lot about this afternoon, and that exhibition was called the Street. And it was really bringing in the street into the museum. And it was reenacted, I think, one or 2 years ago. But again, translation of these ideals changed them into systems of control and exclusion. While institutions absorbed the actions into new levels of management and control by giving the protesters a formal place in the restored hierarchy, public space itself was regulated in such a way that it could control and channel the new ideals. And of course, we all know that, the protesters from the 60s were the university managers from the 90s and onwards, and still are, right? They are our bosses. Let me see. This is sleeping in the center of Amsterdam on Dam Square. Okay, there we go here. Now you see that new forms of channeling this public-private constellation, you see them appearing from quite early on in the 60s, 70s already. So here you see the dislocation of the street within the building. A great example of the new public-private constellation and the strange forms it could result in. This is, you take the street, you bring it into the building, and it leads to really new combinations of public-private that were often not that successful. And a second phase, of course, the neighborhood as a safe zone. These are in Dutch called so-called cauliflower neighborhoods, because they have the form of cauliflowers, and they are actually sort of gated communities before they were known as such. There's an immense amount of social control in these neighborhoods. And then, as a last phase, controlled spaces of gathering, art and entertainment, La Défense, Docklands, and the High Line. So you see, in relation to the notion of public space, that reorganization of the spontaneity has happened over the last 30 years. Now, cities will allow certain spaces to be spaces for events. That's where you come together, to meet and to have fun. That means that if you meet in other spaces, you're suspicious, right? So to stand with 10 people somewhere in the street, not done. The general new zoning of public spaces in which the theater of the public is allocated to special festival spaces or temporary events that absorb its energy. So it's again regulated. Zoning, gentrification, separation and exclusion seem to go hand in hand in this development. Public art in a new societal role makes its appearance from that time. You really get a new tendency in public art in the 70s in Holland, in which it's no longer placing a statue in the public space, but really forming the public space as an event space. While the former institutions of culture lose their authority then and are more and more confused about their roles, public art becomes the big thing, an important symbol of the new playfulness of society. This is a famous work by Peter Struiken, The Blue Waves from 1977. This work is a good example of the complex function of art in the public domain. While it on the one hand aims at stimulating playfulness, helping people to become less sensory deprived or less one-dimensional, of course Marcuse, it does so as part of a government planning that has its own interests, mobility and creativity being some of the more important aspects of the agenda. So, of course, on the one hand, governments were planning modernist neighborhoods that were pretty one-dimensional, and at the same time, capitalism needed creativity and people to be mobile, to move around, to keep their minds open. So you see public art getting a function in this. And there were an immense amount of works of this kind, on this scale, realized in Holland in the 70s. So the work is on the one hand an affordance for new public practices, but on the other hand a tool for control. And this complexity is the hallmark of most interesting works of art in the public domain. They symbolize, stimulate, and make new public practices possible, generate new narratives, but at the same time, they are not just innocent open vessels for citizens to use to their own wish. They also occupy, represent, and confirm dominant narratives. I will come back to this, but for now, we should accept that this complexity should not be held against them. On the contrary, it is their main function. But you should realize it, and especially artists should realize that they always play with different agendas at the same time. In the practice of realizing works of art for the public domain, as for instance in the Beyond project by SCORE, it is the lack of understanding this complexity that leads to too much optimism on the one hand and too much cynicism on the other. And with that, with Beyond, we have to realize that we have passed on to a completely different public-private constellation again. And the theater of the street is completely regulated, it's no longer the case. And again, we have witnessed an ossification of an ideal of publicness or public domain in institutions beyond public control that are controlling the public. Dreams of an open digital society in which communication direct from person to person would be possible and everyone would be included in discussing and sharing everything have been redesigned as consumer data culture controlled by big companies. We all are aware of that. The social media, with their very specific combination of private opinions and relations with the public appearance and demands, play a very big role in this constellation that is, for me, still a little bit too close to see all its consequences, especially for the ideal of a public domain. I cannot really understand what is happening. Predominant, however, seems to be a loop of private opinions influencing public debate that forces commissioning bodies to be really very careful in what they do in and for the public domain. Because any voice can be heard and anything can be held against them. And of course, politicians are really scared of this public voicing of distrust, disgust, spending of money on the wrong things, etc. So you see, in the realizing of art in public space, everyone is really scared of taking too much chances or doing too many experiments. It leads to a culture that combines neoliberal practices of individual responsibility and citizen participation, because that's what governments like to do at this moment. They tell the private public it's all in your hands. You have to do it yourself. With a more and more privatized public space in which the fear of doing experiments and making mistakes overshadows the ambition to create an open polycultural public domain, where tensions are normal and not prevented from the start. If you start missing me somewhere, just shout, and I can repeat something, or I'll answer questions in between if you would like that. This new constellation, public-private, brings with it new questions around commissioning, inclusion, participation and ownership. Questions that we should ask ourselves because we run the risk, or we are in the risk of becoming part of the controlling systems that limits public space while pretending to stimulate it. And we, I mean, of course, organizing bodies, but probably also analyzers, researchers. I cannot deal with all these questions in detail, but I will go into some of them in the rest of this paper. Ownership plays an important role in the debates about the ways towards a more inclusive society, and especially in questions about public space and the role of artworks there. Ownership is at least in Holland, is the big term. And to me, it is central to all the other issues, and one of the more hard problems to solve in relation to art and public space. Because how do you give inhabitants ownership of works of art they have not asked for in the first place? Having them explicitly commission a work themselves or asking them to vote in the design phase are some of the used, and I'm afraid to say, not very successful strategies. And there's no denying that the ownership of the public domain has become an urgent issue. More and more public spaces have come under the control of private parties, companies that more or less colonize these spaces for their own good. I'm not sure how it is here in Stockholm, but for instance, London is a famous example that the area around New City Hall in London, you cannot take photographs there because it's owned by a Japanese company. So you can take selfies, you can use your mobile phone, but the moment you walk around there with a professional camera, you're expelled from the train because it's private. And that's the heart of the public city of London. It's the town hall, which is quite amazing. Cities own less and less of their public space. Investors own more and more. And as I am convinced that cities have to take back control over their public spaces, I am just as convinced that the notion of ownership is not the right term to indicate the ideal of a new public domain shared by all and inclusive to everyone, nor the way to make that ideal approach reality. I have a problem with ownership, not for myself, but for others probably. It's not only the neoliberal sound that the term brings with it that makes me doubt its usefulness. It's also the consequences it implies, or rather the lack of consequences. To own your own environment, to be in charge, to be able to make your own decisions about your own life is a good ideal. But it is a harsh reality that prevents it from ever happening. So while the mental image might be empowering, stimulating and including, the physical reality that would fit that image is an illusion. You do not own your surroundings. An illusion that, however, and that is one of its biggest dangers, that is being kept alive by token ownership of less important things, such as the color of your front door or the artwork in your street. An ownership that is no more than an excuse for authorities to hand over care and control simply to save money. And worse, it can lead to the opposite of inclusion, where the well-to-do own and control their environment in gated communities, while the less-to-do are supposed to take the responsibility they are not able to carry of things they do not really own, such as their own health. We may own a lot of things, but we do not own our surroundings, and we certainly do not own public space. And in my view, we should not own it, especially when we understand public space not as a place, a street or a square, but as an ecology of practices, things we do, and where others do other things. Practices of people and things that simply cannot be appropriated in any way. How am I doing for time? Oh, okay, that's okay. I will give you an example to show how complicated the notion of ownership in relation to works in public space is. This is a sculpture by the constructivist Naum Gabot from 1957 in the city of Rotterdam. It is a modernist, even constructivist sculpture that has no official title. It is not very well loved by the inhabitants of Rotterdam, and when they care to mention it at all, they call it the thing. This thing was till recently in a very bad state, mainly because of ownership discussions. Originally, it was commissioned by the Bijenkorf store next to it in relation to the new Marcel Breuer building as a gift to the city of Rotterdam. A city that was, as you probably know, destroyed by the Germans in the beginning of the Second World War. A gift, but ownership did not go over into the hands of the city, and while ownership of the store changed hands, the interest of the new owners in maintaining it was not very big. So for years the sculpture was badly neglected. It was really falling apart. It was dangerous to walk under it. A couple of years ago, in line with the contemporary ideas about the role of art for the public domain, the city of Rotterdam commissioned the artist Hans van Houwelingen to design a monument for the foreign workers of the city. Rotterdam has a very large population of foreign workers since the 50s and 60s, initially coming from Italy and Spain, but since the 70s, mainly from Turkey and Morocco. The intention or the idea was to have a monument in the neighborhood where most of that population is located as a symbol of welcome, respect, recognition or whatever, but anyway as an instrument to take away tensions and create a feeling of community as these things go. What the city probably had in mind was some kind of fountain, you know, with a uniting text in Dutch, Arabic and Turkish. I think that was their picture. The artist came up with a completely different proposal, however. He proposed that the Gabo sculpture, this one, would be a gift from the city to the foreign workers community, and that they, in return, would restore it with their knowledge of traditional techniques and crafts. And the sculpture would then get the title Foreign Workers Monument. At first, everyone thought it was a great idea. The city, the organizations for foreign workers, etc., etc. It would also give a presence to the foreign workers in the very heart of the city. So I also thought, a great idea. You know, so even in terms of inclusion, yeah, good. Until the Rotterdam International Sculpture Committee, that takes care of the more famous artworks in public space there, advised not to execute the plan, as it would be contradictory to the original meaning of the sculpture. And to make it more complicated, the original meaning of the sculpture was to have no meaning. So to give it a specific title would destroy its original meaning. And I hope you're still with me. Yeah? It seems a very strange idea that you would want to guard the meaning of a work of art in public space. Because the very power of these artworks is that they can be interpreted by anyone in its own way, right? I mean, we can see in a work of art in public space what we want. Anyone can mentally take possession of a work of art in the public domain, weave her own story around it, and no one can prevent that. And especially a sculpture that has no title and that does not seem to represent anything, might seem to beg for it. So why not? On the other hand, you might agree with the sculpture committee that it is exactly this openness of the work of art that disappears the moment you call it a monument for the foreign worker. A more precise reading of the sculpture seems necessary because works of art in public space are not completely left to the wishful thinking of the viewer. We cannot make anything out of them that we want. Their meaning is also dependent on the intention of the artist, the commission, and the context in which it's placed. In this case, the intention of the artist was a monument for the future, a symbol of the new constructive possibilities to come. The intention of the commission and store was a monument for the Jewish employees that had lost their lives during the war. But what does it mean on this site, in close relation to this store building? The initial reaction of the Rotterdam citizens gives us a clue. They regarded it as an advertisement for the shop, a sign to sell more shirts. That is, of course, not what it is, but the freedom of expression and interpretation it stands for is very closely related to, and has been actively exported as such by the American government, the freedom of choice. In the 50s, this is the 50s where abstract expressionism was exported by the American government to Europe as a counterweight against communism. A freedom of choice that not only implies political freedom, or even not at all, if you look at American politics from that time, but that stands for a freedom of consumption. A freedom to buy and own what you want. I have a problem with the notion of ownership, not only because I find it hypocritical, but also because it seems to insert an economic relation into the public domain that, in my view, is contrary to what it should be. But what word should we use to establish a connection between people and their surroundings, and more in particular, the works of art that are part of that surroundings? What language do we use to make the works of art connect us in a very consensual way, or in a very specific dissensual way? The word that I want to introduce to cover all complexities and that does not reduce them to an illusory impossibility is loanership. It doesn't exist, but sounds good. The whole complexity I'm talking about has to do with the new ways to involve people in the process of commissioning, selecting, evaluating, understanding, and loving art in public space. And for years we have been trying all kinds of strategies to reach these goals. And most of these strategies were either cover operations for government agendas and treated with the distrust they deserve, or failed attempts to involve people that had no interest and were just busy leading their lives. I will continue, that's the end of the story, with two examples of recent public space projects, not from the Netherlands, but from Belgium, but Flanders, they speak Dutch too, so I can include them. And I think they see themselves as a Nordic country, while the south of Belgium is a southern country, probably. And Flanders has the advantage that there was almost, the notion of art in public space was also almost non-existent. So it was possible there to do new forms of commissioning and experimenting with new forms of art and participation. The city of Genk, so not Ghent, but Genk, which is more on the east side of Flanders, struggled with the problem that ever more groups of the citizens demanded a memorial of their own. A memorial that would commemorate a specific loss during the Second World War or after that was not experienced to be covered by the existing, very generic Catholic monument, this one. So no one had anything with it. The city commissioned the artist duo De Nicolai and Provoost to do a proposal how to solve this demand for new monuments that the city could not or did not want to handle. The artist came with an idea that in this time, where there's always a request for citizen support and a sort of general overall acceptance of artworks for the public domain, seemed completely and utterly without a chance. I mean, the moment that we read that, I was in the committee, we read the proposal, we thought, this is funny, but it's not going to happen. Their proposal was to design cakes together with the different groups, cakes that would symbolize the loss they had suffered and cakes that would be for sale in the local bakeries. To see the idea as less ridiculous, you have to know that Genk is a town with a long tradition of pastry bakers. So there was a trend there. But anyway, seemingly against all odds, the proposal was accepted. Not only by the city council, but more importantly, by the groups requesting monuments. The city taking the chance, the people not regarding the proposal as a way to sweeten their demands, but as a serious attempt to answer them. So these cakes were designed with different groups, and they all have their special meaning. We should notice that the demand for new, more, and very specific monuments is not the exclusive problem of the city of Genk. Many other towns struggle with the applications for bigger or smaller memorials that want to commemorate very specific events, groups of people. Rotterdam struggles with it, Amsterdam struggles with it. Many countries that have suffered in the Second World War get more of these demands. In the bigger picture, this seems to be part of a new culture of public mourning, the emotionalization of society in which people share their emotions in all possible ways, and in which the social media play an important role. So again, the public-private constellation. Recognition of your problems, memories, presence, and preferences seems to be more and more the leading agenda of citizens meeting in internet platforms and communities. to be recognized and confirmed as a specific group, to be heard as something special, to have things of your own with your own group or community, creates a field of tension within a city policy that on the one hand stimulates citizens to take initiative, participate and be responsible, but that on the other hand does no longer want to be as present as before, step back, cut back, be invisible. So cities stimulate citizens, but they do not want the next step. They do not want to play the role that this taking the responsibility asks from them. So when citizens ask the city, we want this from you, the city says, oh no, that's not what we're for. We're no longer involved in that. The Cake project seems to bridge all the problems in a very nice way. It confirms the group identity, consolidates the group feelings, and finds a form for remembering and celebrating, stressing the social character of the event. You eat the cake together. At the same time, it seems to spare the city an overcrowding with permanent and often ugly tokens of memory, and spares them the costs as well. So it's a win-win situation. It's also in line with the present-day tendency to create more temporary works of art for the public domain, because they do not permanently occupy space, are more flexible, raise less protest, because they will leave again, and are generally cheaper. There is a problem there, that we found out that temporary works of art, not these cakes, but there's a lot of temporary works of art, and we call that now, in some discussion, the new permanent, because when a work of art is there, and maybe the project with the living room is also an example, when a work is there, people want it to stay. And of course, it has been, the money is only for temporary, so, yeah, what to do next, right? It's temporary, go, right? So that is something that is still not debated about enough or thought about enough. Second example, also very interesting. This is a piece of common land in the heart of Ressegem, which is a small village in Flanders, which is part of a larger community called Herzelen. And you see more pictures of it. And it was to be developed by this larger city, and they wanted to appropriate it either as a new town hall. This was the idea. Then the former common ground would be in the middle of a sort of living block and town hall. And when the people around it turned it down, the idea was to turn it into a sort of nature experience park, which of course for the inhabitants didn't look that attractive either. So when the chance came for this village or this larger community to commission artists to do a work there, of course they thought participation is the thing. Let's do a community project. And so the idea was to look for a participatory work of art that would unite the inhabitants and probably give them a new feeling of ownership. There we go again. Now, 2 artists were invited, Birte Lehmeyer and David Helber, but they proposed to split up the land in individual plots to be handed out to all inhabitants, making everyone responsible, but each on his or her own, not as a group, but everyone visible to all others. So if you participate, that's okay. You design your plot of land together with the artist, but if you don't participate, you become visible as not participating because your piece of land overgrows, right? I find it a really interesting concept. Because in a lot of participation projects, you see the participators, but not the non-participators. To be developed together with the artist during 2 years, temporary, to end in a process of negotiation and probably a solution what to do with the land in the end. So although the piece of ground was already common ground, it would be partitioned out to people in loan for a period of 2 years. Let me see. Okay, that was it. So far, the project has not been realized. Ironically, because the plots of land were rented out to farmers that did not want to give up their contract. So it was the city, the land was owned by the city or by the village, but they could not take it back because they had a contract with farmers who had their horses or their sheep on it. Sheep again, right? So the loan aspect was already a very present reality and the ownership was problematic. And the second reason that it failed, and I think that was a mistake by the artists, that they were so busy planning the project and negotiating with the town council and the farmers that rented the land, that they forgot to involve the inhabitants. They were left out of the deal. And I always thought, even if you don't have this land yet, energize everyone and say, you get a piece of land, come on, let's start something. I'm sure the farmers would yield within no time because you don't want the whole community against you, but they never did that. Ownership does not solve all the problems of the functioning of art in public domain, nor does it solve the problem of the ongoing privatization of the public domain. But I think that as a term, it can be a very strong tool for understanding how we have to share an environment, how we are all part of an ecology of practices that we cannot own, but that we can use for a while, and then give back or loan again, or loan with others under other conditions. There's an element of generosity in the term of care that is missing in the notion of ownership. It also leads to other more realistic demands. Although the involved groups in Genk are again still asking for permanent symbols of loss, they now understand better that they cannot appropriate the public spaces of the city, while the city understands that it can come to an agreement with them without having to promise them permanent works of art, of sculptures for eternity. So there's a new understanding of temporality and of ownership. And to conclude, for the artist working in public space for a specific community, it really helps if she can understand that she cannot represent that community, cannot play into their demands and needs directly, but can loan them to create an art approach that offers them a new understanding. And for the inhabitants, that they do not own the artist, they loan her capacities for the realization of a great work of art, that they can mentally appropriate time and again, but never own, because it fundamentally is shared with others, with any other, permanently. Thank you very much. Thanks.